I awoke in the darkness. For a moment, I was unsure of where I was, who I was. The blackness was all-encompassing, smothering. In a panic, I lashed out my hand, connecting with the coffin lid, and that's when it all came rushing back, and I settled back down into my own grave. Something had awoken me from my long slumber, a noise, a certain delicious aroma, and there it was again. The sound of scraping feet and heavy breath. My nostrils flared and I breathed in that delicious scent, the scent of spilled blood and fear. For a moment I considered going back to my dreams, terrible as they were, but the bloodthirst was too much and I sat up, pushing the stone lid off my sarcophagus aside, where it crashed to the floor with a resounding thud. There was a man in my tomb, the moonlight dancing across his crumpled form where he stood leaning heavily against the stone walls. "Right then," he gasped, "just like Miss Natasha said, all this time." He winced, clinging to his bleeding side. "You've been here all along." "I'm as real as you are," I said, stepping out of my grave. My voice sounded rusty after so many years without speech. "How is it you know of me? And who is this Natasha? Is she one of the family?" "Yes," he said. "She told me of you, begged me to find you. After the Germans arrived, said that you were here, the guardian of the family, that her grandmother told her." Then he tapered off, coughing harshly, blood wetting his lips. Something stirred in me then, but I fought it back. Drawing closer as I did, he cowered down into himself, my face washed in moonlight. Germans. Why are the Germans here? What of the French? What of Bonaparte's army? Did they find the chateau? "Bonaparte," he gasped. "That was over 100 years ago. The Germans are here now. They've invaded Mother Russia. Those black dog Nazis are crawling all over the countryside. They came to the house. They have Natasha and Isabel. And they use them for entertainment." "Entertainment?" I growled. "They use my family for their entertainment." "Yes," he sighed. Weakly. "My own family was killed, lined up against a wall, shot, while I hid like a coward. I managed to escape, but one of the sentries saw me fleeing into the night and did this." He removed his hand from the gaping wound. "I ran to the family cemetery to find you, and so I die like I lived. Serving the family." "You were a servant, then?" I asked, squatting down beside him. "Yes. My family have served the House of Radek for nearly 100 years, and that's how we know of you and your legend, a guardian, a spirit who has protected the family for centuries, but I see now that you're no spirit," he said, looking hard into my face. "You're something else. A beer, yes, a vaudeville." I nodded solemnly. "Yes. I am a vampire. The family is all that is left of my mortal self. They are the descendants of my own children. I've watched over them for centuries. When the French came, I moved them far from the fighting and installed them deep in the chateau in the forest. Then I built this place," I said, looking around at the damp, cold walls, and I went to sleep as the dreaded day spilled its sunlight over the world. Now you tell me that I've slept over 100 years and my family is in danger once again from foreign invaders." "Yes," he said weakly, and I realized he had very little time left. "What is your name?" I asked him. "Dmitri." "You're a good and faithful servant, Dmitri. Will you serve the House of Radek one last time?" I have grown weak in my long slumber, and I have need of substance and knowledge. In your blood is the memory of all you have done and all the knowledge you have learned in your days upon earth. I have need of both, like never before, if I am to save the family. You understand? You want to drink from me? Drink my blood? I nodded, but said no more. Will it hurt? He asked, resigned to his fate. Only a little, I answered, like the sting of a bee in sweet summer, then only ecstasy and beautiful darkness. Very well. Take what you need. I have nothing left in this world and would see the face of my children once again. Gently. Oh, so gently, I took his face in my cold hands. He shuddered at my touch, and I tried to back away, but I caught him up. My head darting forward, piercing his throat. What ecstasy, then, as his blood filled my mouth, gushing down my throat. It was all over far too soon, and I fell back against the cold walls of my crypt. His fresh blood on my mouth and his dying thoughts racing through my mind. Monsters, I whispered into the darkness. Now his knowledge was my knowledge, and I knew my family was in terrible danger from these Nazis who had swept across the world, killing millions. Death camps, I whispered again, and they call me monster. But I had never killed for an ideal, or put a man in chains to serve my own greed. I had only ever killed to survive. Did the lion or the tiger not do the same? Rising to my feet, I knew all that was about to change. These Germans had invaded my home and defiled my family. Killing them would be a pleasure, and I intended to revel in it. I rose to my feet, feeling the blood working on my body, returning some of my old strength. I turned, meaning to be about my business, but I could not leave poor Dimitri's body to the rats. So I scooped him up, and I laid him in my stone crypt, gripping the stone lid up as if it weighed nothing. I marveled at my restored strength before heading into the night. If the world outside had changed, I could not see it. The night was cold and snow fell heavily, frosting the nearby trees. All was the same as I had left it, except for a few snow-covered graves nearby. Strolling over, unmindful of the cold, I wiped away snow from a leaning tombstone. The inscription read Elizabeth Roddick, 1890 to 1910. Taken into dark waters. I wondered who she had been, this daughter of my lineage, and why she had died so young. It was a temptation to examine more of these ancient markers, but I had no time to tarry, and so I headed into the driving snow towards the distant lights of the chateau. Using the great speed of the vampire, I was there in moments, laying prone in the snow upon a small hill that overlooked my former home. The chateau was more like a small castle than anything else, and yet my eyes saw only the wood hut that had once stood in its place. I had once lived there as a mortal man, but that was before the Turks had invaded, and I had left my family to go to war, conscripted by the noble man who owned the land and everyone on it. I remembered the biting cold, the forced march, many dying of sickness and fatigue before we had reached the battlefield, the rows of men, the frost glinting off their armor, the war cry and pounding of the drums from the Turkish hordes, fire in the night, the clash of steel and screams of dying men. An arrow tore into my side, and I ran from the madness into the night, desperate to survive, to see my family once again. Just over a week later, I had staggered into my yard, half dead from starvation and the terrible cold. A small light flickered inside, but I sensed even then that something was terribly wrong. Hurrying as best I could in my feeble state, I stumbled into the doorway. My eyes widened in surprise as I looked at the filth-covered stranger that sat by a small flickering fire. It was a woman covered in dirt and rags. Her eyes burned crimson in the firelight as she turned to face me. "Who are you?" I demanded. "And where's my family?" "Your family? I thought this place was abandoned, yet you are the rightful owner?" "I am," I said, hungry for the fire's warmth. As soon as the words left my mouth, the woman started to shake violently as if in the grip of some great seizure. Blood burst from her nose as she screamed, barreling past me into the night. I turned shocked, and there she was. She stood at the threshold looking at me longingly. "Please," she begged. "You must invite me back inside." I was cautious of her now and thought her a madwoman. "And why should I do that?" I said, blocking the doorway. "I have news of your family. I know where they are. Invite me back inside and I will tell you the truth of it." "Very well," I conceded. "Come back inside and then out of the cold. Tell me, is there any food left?" "No," the woman said, gliding towards me. "There's nothing here, and I myself am very hungry." At her approach, I noticed for the first time how beautiful she really was under all that dirt. The paleness of her skin, the way her eyes seemed to catch the firelight. "So tell me," I said, falling into a nearby chair. "Where are my wife and children?" "Here," she said, grabbing up an unseen letter from a shadow-soaked table and thrusting it into my hand. Quickly, I tore it open, and I began to read. The letter was from my wife. She told me that she was afraid and alone, and that our neighbors had told her of the approaching Turks. She was taking her children and fleeing to the capital. "God keep them safe," I groaned, staggering to my feet and shambling toward the door. She laughed then. "Where do you think you're going?" "To find my wife and children," I said over my shoulder. "You're either too stupid or too stubborn to realize. You're dying." It was as if her words held some terrible prophecy. Suddenly, the room started to spin. My legs gave out as I slumped in the doorway, the swirling snow freezing my face. "No," I gasped. "I can't. Not now. My children." "One cannot barter with death," she said, drawing nearer. "But one can become it." Reaching down, she drew me into her arms and carried me back into the room, and laid me by the fire. "How?" I gasped, horrified by her terrible strength. "What are you?" "We have many names. My own I've forgotten over the long centuries, but you can call me Babette. One name is as good as another. And for what I am Mori, vampire, one of the undead. Do you see?" She smiled, revealing teeth a wolf would have been proud of. "You're dying. But you are brave, strong, and willful. And I've been alone for far too long. I would make you one of us. You'll be damned. Have to kill every night of your life. But you will live. Cursed as we are, you will live. Or," she shrugged, "you can accept the nature of things and die. Here. I'm hungry, and will ease your suffering with my kiss. But you can never see the faces of your children again. Now decide. Time grows short for you." I could no longer speak. Black blooms were filling my vision, and it felt like I was falling. In a last desperate attempt, I grabbed her skirt and tried to pull her towards me. "Done," she said. And so I became the creature that I became. On a howling, snow-filled night much like this one. And in this very place over 500 years ago, in a ramshackle hut I had once called home. The hut was gone. In its place stood a fine house, a sanctuary where I had watched the descendants of my children grow, thrive, prosper. But now, once again, invaders had come to our land and my family was in terrible danger. Crawling through the snow, I broke through a line of trees and got the first real look at my home. Damn them, I cursed from between gritted teeth. The whole place was lit up like a Christmas tree. Searchlights swept the courtyard, and armed sentries patrolled the grounds. A little away from the house stood some sort of iron chariot on wheels. I searched the blood memories of a faithful Dimitri and saw that this was a truck, a thing for transporting weapons and people. There were 4 of them drawn up, side by side. In front, men stood by a smoking barrel, warming their hands over the flickering flame, their cold breath scenting the night. They smelled of iron, leather, and blood, and for the first time the hunger in me rose like some terrible, malignant spirit, intent on my undoing. For a moment I tried to fight it, but it was too strong. Bones like daggers speared through my gums as my fingers grew talon-like and sharp. I was moving now, slithering through the snow like some wretched demon intent on their destruction. As I drew near, I heard one laugh. "She's a feisty one, all right. Fought like a polecat, but a few knocks to the head put her majesty in her place." "Yeah," another one laughed. "She didn't have much time left when I got to her. Same about the other. She picked up a knife. Captain put a bullet in her. No one threatens the SS." On hearing this, I screamed into the night and leapt amongst my tormentors, sending the fire barrel flying, scattering burning hot coals amongst them. In their panic, they tried to draw their weapons, but I was already amongst them, tearing at their flesh. Blood spattering the snow, and there were cries of alarm from the house. I didn't care. I would destroy these men, tear them limb from bloody limb for whatever they had done. All were down now, all but one who had fallen into the snow, bloody but very much alive. He drew his weapon from his shoulder. There was a deafening roar as hot lead peppered my body, but still, I came on, grinning my ghoulish grin. "You cannot kill me, friend," I hissed, grabbing him by the throat. I lifted him off the ground, letting my chisel-like nails slowly tear through his flesh. He began to gargle, his eyes bulging with terror as I closed my fist, tearing out his throat in a welter of blood. Others were on the run now, closing in on my position. For a moment, I was tempted to stand out and fight, but I had already lost the advantage of surprise and so melted into the shadows, becoming one with the darkness as I faded high into a nearby tree that loomed over the grisly scene. Seconds later, more men arrived. Their leader, a tall, slender man dressed in a long black coat and peaked cap. A death's head insignia gleamed in the darkness. "Mother of God," he gasped. "What happened here?" Another man tried to answer him, his mouth working silently before he staggered away, doubled over and breathing hard. "A bear, perhaps," an older man with a large mustache said. "It's winter here, Sergeant," another man interjected. "All the bears will be hibernating." "It's always winter here, fool," the sergeant spat, cowing the other man. "What else could have done this to such heavily armed men?" "Look," the captain said, bending down and scooping up a rifle. "One of them had managed to get a shot off. So where's the creature's body?" "Probably ran off into the forest to die," the sergeant said. "The snow is starting to get heavy. We could form a search party to hunt down or to confirm, but we would probably just end up losing more men to the cold." "Yes," the captain said, "but I want these men covered over and the sentries doubled. Tomorrow we'll form a search party at first light and a burial detail. It's late. I wish to sleep. You're in charge, Sergeant. Wake me up at first light." That said, he marched away, leaving the other men to carry out the assigned tasks. Yeah, prick, the sergeant muttered as he walked away. I hope his Weisswurst freezes off in the night. Unlikely, another man chipped in. He had me cutting up firewood for his room in the tower all day. More was said, but I missed it, so I was already on the move, flitting between trees, heading up for the aforementioned tower. If you wanted to kill a snake, you cut off the head, and this particular snake was resting its head under my very roof. But that was fine. I had built this home and put certain measures in place, in this case a secret entrance that stood at the base of the tower, one of the two, the other a tunnel leading from a cellar deep in the forest. Only one of the two girls now lived, and everything hinged on her survival. Moments later, another man lay crumpled at my feet, dead and drained of his life's blood, the thing I had seen through the blood kiss. For this one had served in Poland at a place called Auschwitz, and my only regret was I couldn't kill him twice. Quickly I moved into the shadows of the tower and selected a certain block of stone. I pushed it, exerting all of my supernatural strength until at last, with a grudging grate, it gave and sprung a rusting mechanism and revealed a hidden door. Moving with the grace and stealth of the vampire, I ascended the winding staircase until I saw a flickering light just around the corner and heard the scraping of a booted foot on stone. Springing from the shadows, I leapt at the startled man and drove my fist through his gaping maw. With a spatter of bone and teeth, I grabbed his spine and tore his head free, gathering the fallen body before it could clatter to the floor. "You died too fast," I spat into his face, before laying his head back onto his body. From the other side of the door came a sleep-filled grunt, and all was still. Slowly, I pushed through the door, which swung open easily. Not even locked, I mused. How arrogant these men of the so-called master race were. But there was only one master here, I thought, as I crossed the night-darkened room to the bed. The leader of these men, the so-called captain, lay on his back, his breathing heavy and regular as he slept. Gentle as a lover, I strangled his prone form and slapped him rudely awake. With a cry, his eyes flew open, but I had already seized the twisting tongue, my other hand wrapped around his throat. After a little time, he stopped his grunting and heaving, knowing he was trapped, and slowly I lowered my face towards his, smelling the urine that spilled from him as I drew closer. "You are a dead man," I whispered in his ear. "How you die is up to you. I have lived many years, and I know how to draw out a man's death. Such sweet agonies I could show you before you die, or you could answer a simple question and die quickly and painlessly. The choice is yours. Do you understand me?" Quickly he nodded his head. "I shall release you now. If you cry out, I will rip the tongue from your head. Do we have an understanding?" Again he nodded, and I withdrew my fingers from his tainted mouth. "The girl?" I asked. "Where's the girl?" In the cellar," he babbled. "She's not been hurt. I kept her from the men." He took a sharp intake of breath at the look on my face and tried to scream, being a man of my word. I tore his tongue from his mouth, and I cast it across the room before driving my fingers through his eyes and piercing the diseased brain beneath. He buckled and spasmed, but was soon dead. I wiped my hand on the sheets, eager to be rid of his tainted blood before heading for the cellar. I encountered no more men on my travels, though I sensed them sleeping or patrolling nearby. When I arrived at the cellar door, I found it unguarded but locked. Concentrating my force, I pushed near the lock until the door jamb splintered and finally gave way, revealing the room inside. What I saw then turned my blood cold. Amongst the barrels and kegs lay a naked girl, perhaps no older than 30. upon the cold stone. Her marble skin was covered in boot-shaped bruises, the skin on her thigh torn and scratched. Blood seemed to be trickling from every part of her body. Her breathing was harsh and shallow. No, 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 I cried, running forward and falling to my knees where I gathered her up. She looked at me then, and I saw the fine features so resembled those of my long-dead daughters. "My child," I whispered, rocking her to and fro. "My sweet child, what have they done to you?" She looked up at me, but did not scream at my terrible visage. "You are real, then. Natasha always said it was so. She would spend hours when we were children looking at your portrait hanging in the main hall and playing round the family crypt. Our grandmother told us that you were there, a family spirit, sleeping but ever vigilant, our protector. But you could not protect us. Now Natasha's dead," she sobbed weakly, "and I'm dying. They broke something inside of me, and now I'll die here, alone." My head was reeling now. The last of my family were here, dying in my arms, the last vestige of my mortal self. "No," I whispered into the darkness. "I won't let it end like this." Slowly, almost reverently, I raised my wrist to my mouth and I bit down hard. As the blood began to flow, I pressed it to Isabel's mouth. "Forgive me," I whispered. But she only smiled up at me weakly and began to drink. The rest of that long night was punctuated by the screams of the dying, and Isabel took her revenge on her tormentors and her sister's killers. She did not rush into her deaths, but made them suffer long and loud. And when the screams subsided, I left the cellar to find her. She was in the ballroom, setting to rights a fallen Christmas tree. All around her lay the bloody, torn hunks of flesh that had once been men. I smiled at her as I passed. Her long, slender arms caressed my shoulders. It was getting close to dawn now. I sat upon the window ledge, contemplating all that had been done that night, hearing my heavy sigh, and perhaps sensing my mood. Isabel glided across the room and put her head against my shoulder. "What is it, Father? Do I not please you?" "Very much," I said, patting her cheek fondly. But much had been lost that night. My family's no more. All those long centuries guarding my beloved children, and now they're no more. "You have me," she smiled up at me. "A daughter that will be with you forever." "Yes," I smiled back gently. "For that I am blessed. But it's not the same. All that was left of me, all that was mortal, lived in you, and now it's been lost forever." "Oh," she laughed. "Is that all? Come," she said, drawing me away from the window. "I have a special Christmas gift for you." There under the Christmas tree, just as the first rays of light defiled the darkness of night, she whispered 2 words: "Bucharest" and "brother." I was looking at a dead man. He did not know he was a dead man, but he was. Nevertheless, I had picked up his diseased thoughts as I stood in Times Square, taking the grandeur of the human city. When this mortal barreled past me, rushing into a nearby alleyway, his thoughts trailed behind him like some loathsome miasma. He was a killer and a rapist, fleeing from his latest atrocity, desperate to bury himself in the heart of the faceless city. He thought himself a predator, but I was about to show him the true meaning of the word. Moving to the face of the alley, I took to the rooftops in a blur of speed, moving swiftly and silently as I stalked the killer below. He was rounding a corner now, heading to a nearby car park. "Not so fast, my friend," I growled, tasting my own blood as razor-sharp teeth elongated, shearing through my gums, my fingers growing like talons. Leaping high into the air, I landed hard upon his back, driving him down to the ground. Claws shearing through his clothes, tearing into his flesh as I pinned him in place. He screamed like a wounded animal as a sweet aroma of blood perfumed the air. "I'm gonna kill you now," I breathed into his ear, reveling in his fear. "But first," I said, digging my claws into his writhing crotch, "I'm gonna relieve you of this." Using all of my supernatural strength, I tore at him, gelding him in one fluid motion. He screamed then, howling in pain, but he was soon silenced as I tore open his throat and drank of his tainted blood, swallowing his life, and ultimately, all of his memories. After it was over, I tossed him into a nearby dumpster, trying to erase the faces of his victims from my mind. But I knew it would take some time. Nevertheless, I accepted it. I was damned, after all, and deserved no better. I was just starting to fade into the shadows when a voice boomed in my head, causing me to cry in pain. "Nicholas Radek, come to us." God damn them, I cursed, gritting my teeth against another psychic blast. But none was forthcoming. The Council of Elders had summoned me, and that meant now, immediately. One did not refuse an invitation from the Council, not if one wanted to keep living. God damn them, I cursed again, knowing I would have to give up the search for my daughter, Isabel. She was here, somewhere, in this vast, sprawling metropolis, and I intended to find her. But first, the council must be appeased. There was bad business ahead, perhaps killing business. I only hoped I was not the intended victim. Praying to a god who had long turned his face from me, with the sunrise hot on my heels, I headed north, on a wing and a prayer. Less than 2 days later, I stood in the frozen cavern that served as the council's chamber. Before me stood 3 great thrones, carved from the blackest obsidian. Upon them sat 2 men, and 1 woman. Together they made up the Council of Elders, the oldest, wisest, and most feared of vampire kind. "Welcome, Nicholas Radek," the woman bowed mockingly. "Keeper of the family." "Jeanette, Mistress of Darkness," I said, returning her bow. "What family?" the man by her side interjected. "The last of his mortal line is no more, murdered by his own daughter." "Bartholomew," I said, bowing even lower. "My daughter did not murder her brother. She merely changed him." "Yes," he stormed, leaping to his feet and pointing an accusing finger. "And whose fault is that? You converted your daughter into one of us without the consul's permission, then took a newborn vampire and housed her with a mortal." I could not deny these accusations, for they were all true. I found my daughter, Isabel, alone, dying in the chateau that I had built long ago to house and protect the last of my mortal lineage. Her own sister had been murdered, and herself brutally beaten at the hands of the invading Nazis who would dare to enter my home. Her sweet face had looked so much like that of my own long-lost daughter that I knew I could never endure the pain of her loss, and so I gave her the blood kiss, turned her into a daughter of darkness. The rest of that long night, she had reveled in her newfound powers, taking a terrible vengeance on her tormentors. Later, just as the terrible sun caressed the night, she had told me a joyous secret, that the descendants of my children still lived in the form of her younger brother, who now resided in war-torn Bucharest. The journey from Russia to Romania had been a long one. The nights were spent feeding on the dying and the desperate, of which there were plenty as the German war machine moved across the land. The days were spent hiding in ruined basements, shallow graves, till at long last we reached a grimy apartment building where the last remaining survivor of the family lived in poverty and desperation. Isabel approached first, knocking on the apartment door. She had recently fed on one of the iron guard who patrolled the nearby streets, and now, flushed with his blood, she looked more or less human. A man opened the door. He was perhaps 20, slight of build. "Isabel," he breathed, falling into her arms but quickly withdrew, perhaps feeling the cold hardness of her skin or feeling the fire that burned under her lidded eyes. But it was too late. Isabel had already caught him in her iron grip. "Invite us in, brother," she commanded. "The night is cold, and there are Germans about." "What?" he stuttered. "Of course, come in." The rest of the night was spent in deep conversation. Her brother was already aware of the family legend of an immortal protector. We did not lie to him, but told him everything from my long history to Isabel's recent conversion. After some moments of disbelief and many questions, he accepted the truth, and we started to outline a plan to escape the country and flee to England, the last bastion of hope against these Nazi invaders. But it had all gone terribly wrong. We had been with Sebastian just over a month, fleeing through occupied France, when he had taken a bullet to the guts. As soon as the sun set, I was out desperately scouring the war-torn buildings for medical supplies. When I returned, Sebastian was gone, and Isabel terribly wounded. In her desperation, she had tried to give her brother the dark kiss. But she was too young and inexperienced, and had instead created a monster, a revenant, a blood fiend, a crazed vampire who suffered from an eternal hunger, whose craving for blood could never be fulfilled. In my despair and anger, I had quickly healed her wounds and abandoned her there, and now I sought to make things right between us, beg for forgiveness for my unjust rage. For had I not done the very same thing to her to save her own life? "Radek!" It was the third member of the council that now stood. "I hope for your sake you are listening to us." "Of course," I said, dragging myself back from the past. "I am at your service, Master Aries. What would you have of me?" "I would have your full attention, for a start," the tall man said, sitting back down and straightening the cuffs of his immaculately tailored suit. "Your son is here in the new world, tearing at its very heart. We want you to find him and bring him to justice. He is no more than a rabid beast, and he must be treated the same." "What Marius is trying to say," Jeanette interjected, "is we want him dead. We've crossed paths with him before, and done nothing. How many mortal lives have been wasted because you try to cling to your foolish humanity? This council wants him dead, and you will be our instrument in this." "No," I replied. "I will not destroy this child of my blood. I understand it must be done, but I will not be the one to do it. I cannot. Though I give my consent for the council to end his life, humanely and painless, if this is the only way." She laughed, but her eyes burned with anger. "How arrogant you are, Lord Radek. You give your consent. If this council wishes to catch this fiend and torture him for 1,000 years, you can do nothing about it." "You're wrong, Jeanette," I said, drawing closer. My body thrummed with energy. "I can always kill you." Again she laughed, and I felt her own power begin to crawl over my skin like biting insects. "You are old, Radek, and powerful, but you are not an elder. Not yet. And you can't possibly believe you can destroy me." "Are you willing to take that risk?" I spat at her. "How willing are you to give up your immortality? Personally, mine means nothing to me, and I'm willing to die. Are you?" She hesitated. Then, before looking over her shoulder to the other council members, as if seeking reassurance, Maris raised an eyebrow and waved her into her seat where she sat. Her crimson eyes bore into me. "I'm afraid this conversation has taken a rather boring turn," he said, stroking his finely trimmed beard. "Jeanette does not stand alone. The Vampire Council stands as one. An attack on one is an attack on us all, and that, Nicholas, is not something you can stand against. The order stands. You will find your son and destroy him. If you do not, your own life is forfeit, and that of your daughters too. You may not care about your own life, but you do care about hers. Now take this," he said, flicking a slender card towards me, which I plucked from the air. "It's the address of a certain police detective we have on payroll. She has been investigating the vile murders your son has been committing. She's expecting you." "New York." I glared at them. "I just left that city to come here." "Yes," Jeanette smirked. "You were looking for your daughter." "Yes," I replied, trying to hide my own smoldering rage. I sensed her in the city. "Well then," she said, blowing me a kiss, "perhaps you can have a nice little family reunion." "Goodbye, Radek," Marius said, standing and fading into the shadows. "Fail us, and lose all that you love." I turned, and I fled from them, Jeanette's wicked laughter chasing me into the waiting night. The following night I stood outside an apartment complex on the wind-blown street. Lights seemed to burn from every window, defiling the darkness. Stood at the door was a small woman, elf-like, with brutal short hair. At my approach, she opened the door and smiled up at me. "You must be Nicholas Radek. I've been expecting you." "Yes, I am Nicholas Radek." "Well then, please come in." Her invitation surprised me. "Are you so eager to invite strange vampires into your abode?" "Those sanctioned by the council, yes. Besides, I was told you could help me with the spree of murders going on in the city." "Perhaps," I said, following her up a narrow flight of stairs and into her apartment. "What's your name?" "Jane," she said, sitting across from me. "Detective Jane Lucenza." There was something about her that I found to be almost irritating. There was a certain smugness, a confidence around her kind that would inevitably end to her death. I smiled at her, then, and let some of the hunger I was feeling bleed into my eyes. "So, tell me about these murders," I growled. Her face blanched and she stood up quickly, her heart beating hard in her chest. "Of course," she said, a little breathlessly. I have a file. She scurried across the room to a nearby cabinet. A dark part of me wanted to chase her, but I sat back, forcing myself to relax. Here it is, she said, slowly approaching me with a large file, which she placed on the table between us. May I ask you a question? She said, slowly sitting back down. Have you fed tonight? No. I lied, scooping up the file. She said nothing to this, but I could smell the light sweat that broke out across her skin. The file was large and stuffed with photos. 4 families, torn apart in various parts of the city. Innocent men, women, and children slain by my misbegotten son. So, I said, throwing the file back down on the table. What now? Now we wait, she said, producing a radio device from under her short jacket. For what? The night grows short. For another murder. The council has guaranteed there will be another tonight. I am the detective in charge. When it happens, I'll be the first on the scene. I'll have some time alone with the bodies to investigate before the forensics teams and the photographers arrive. It'll be a small window, but enough time for you to do whatever it is you need to do. Till then, perhaps you would like to feed. Is that an offer? I asked, leaning forward, showing my teeth. No, she quickly replied. I thought you would like to go out. And who would you suggest I feed off, officer? I spat. Your neighbors. Your friends. I do not slay the innocent. Sorry. I didn't realize. You're not like the others, are you? We are all monsters, I said, standing and heading towards a nearby window. That's something you should never forget. We're all monsters. A few hours later, we pulled up in a quiet suburban street, or it would have been. Blue lights flashed in the night, and masses of people stood outside the hastily erected police tape that surrounded a small 2-story residence. Cell phones in hand, eager to capture the latest atrocities. God damn it, the detective hissed, turning towards me. I'm sorry about this. I'll have some of my men clear the street. Don't bother, I said, climbing out of the car. They can't capture my image off their silly little cameras. It'll be like I was never there. They, however, will be a problem, I said, pointing to the nearby officers. No, she said, coming around the car and standing by my side. They won't. They're under my command and know better than to ask questions. Still, she said, sliding a badge over my neck. A little window dressing never hurts. Come on. We have about 15 minutes before forensics arrive. Quickly, she took the lead, barking orders at the nearby men. When we were in the hall, she turned to me. How is it you can enter this place without an invitation? The rightful owners are all dead, I replied, sensing blood in the air. One does not need permission to enter Eternal House. This way, I said, heading toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. Wait, the detective said, pulling on a pair of latex rubber gloves. This is my crime scene. I go first. Be my guest, I said, stepping aside. With a trembling hand, she reached out and threw the doors open. How to describe the scene inside? It was the man I saw first. He was lying face down on the kitchen counter, his back torn open. His spine had been snapped and gleamed wetly through his torn flesh. The woman lay on the hardwood floor. Her severed head had been laid in her gaping stomach like some obscene joke. Her bulging eyes seemed to stare up at me with mute accusation. Mother of God, the detective said. What kind of animal would do such a thing? My son, I whispered. My son did this. The council was right. He has to die. Your son, she said, turning to face me. Your son did this? You must leave now, I said over my shoulder as I knelt by the poor, defiled body of the dead woman. I must do something unsightly. Guard the door. It'll only take a moment. She looked like she wanted to argue, but in the end, did as she was bid. When the door was firmly shut, I reached out a pale hand and brushed my fingers through the cold blood before placing them in my mouth. Immediately, the blood memories burned through my mind. I was in a kitchen, my husband, Ken, drinking wine when a large picture window exploded in a shower of biting glass. There was a monster in the room with us, a pale-skinned creature whose eyes burned with madness. In a blur of motion, it struck down Ken in a welter of blood. I began to scream, snarling. It turned towards me. I froze. The image there in my mind, looking at the terrible visage of my demented son. The burning eyes and blood-smeared face. I tried to look for clues to his whereabouts. Perhaps on his clothes, anything I could use to find him, but there was nothing. He wore a shredded t-shirt, torn, bloody jeans. His hair was long, straggly, covered in leaves. Apart from that, there was nothing. Sighing, I spat the cold, dead blood from my mouth. I'm sorry, I said to the dead woman, gently stroking her hair. I will find him. Somehow. I will find him. Just then there came a knock from the other side of the door. You have to get out of here now, the detective's voice was muffled. Meet me back at my apartment. The council has decreed that you must stay with me until this is all over. I said nothing, but I fled into the night. The sound of sirens following me into the darkness. Detective Lukenza returned later that night, looking tired and more than a little pissed off. Well, she said, standing before me, hands on hips. What'd you find out? Nothing, I replied. Only confirmation that it is Sebastian doing the killing. So what now? She said, stripping off her gun and pouring herself some coffee. I don't know, I said. But waiting for another murder is not an option. We have to find my daughter, Isabel. She is his sister. And his mother in darkness. If anyone can find him, she can. Sounds like a plan, she said, sitting down with a sigh. I said nothing to this. When the silence drew on, she yawned and stretched luxuriously. Well, it's getting late. I need some sleep. Come with me, Nicholas Raddick. The room she showed me to was small, with only one north-facing window, which had been painted black and shrouded with heavy black drapes. I looked around the room, which contained only a small single bed and a mirrorless chest of drawers. Not much, she said, perhaps sensing my thoughts. But it will protect you from the sun. Some of the council used this room when they were here on business. What an honor, I said, climbing on the bed. I hope you changed the sheets. She ignored this, but did not leave the room. Of course, she said. If the room's not to your liking, my room has some thick curtains, and the bed is somewhat bigger. You may find some warmth there, or even a little comfort. Good night, detective, I said, closing my eyes. Wake me when the sun sets below the horizon. Get a fucking alarm clock, she huffed, slamming the door behind her. I smiled, just as the dawn hit the horizon, dragging me down into the unfathomable depths. I was dreaming my daughter Isabel was with me, stroking my face lovingly. Her glorious face, so like that of my own long-dead children, smiling down at me with sympathy and compassion. Wake up, Father. The sun is set. We have much to discuss. I suddenly realized I was not dreaming. She was actually here, my beloved daughter, who I had not seen in over half a century. Isabel, I gasped, clasping her hand in my own. Is it really you? Yes, she replied in her musical voice. It is really me. How did you find me? You were my father in darkness. I always know how to find you. Yet, you stayed away for so long. Her smile faltered then. The last time we spoke, you were so mad at me, I thought you would never wish to see me again. After what I did to Sebastian. No, child, I said, taking her in my arms. That was my fault, as much yours. I should never have put you in such a situation, and the things I said were spoken in anger and rage at myself, as much as you. Can you forgive me, my Isabel? I already have, Father, she said, returning my embrace. Long ago. So many years wasted, I laughed, holding her at my arm's length, taking in her beauty. It was only then that I noticed for the first time the smear of blood across her lips. Where is Detective Lakenza? How did you get in here? Did she invite you in? As a matter of fact, she did. Isabel grinned, showing blood-stained teeth. Quite an interesting character, that one. Isabel. I thrust her aside and heading out the door. What have you done? Not to worry, Father, she called after me. It was only a little sip. I found the detective slumped in a chair, weak but very much alive. I'm sorry for this, I said, kneeling before her. Why? She said, her eyes rolling back in her head. It was glorious. Isabel. I shook my head at her as she entered the room. You know we never feed off the innocent. Innocent? This one? She laughed, perching on the side of the chair beside the sleeping woman. You should have seen the things I saw in her blood. A right little vampire junkie, this one. Do you know the council even promised to make her one of us someday? Why do you think she does the things she does? She sold her body and soul for the promise of immortality. But enough about her, she said, standing up and offering her hand, which I gladly took. We have to talk, Father. About Sebastian. He's here. In the city. I've spoken with him. He's changed, Father. Every year that passes, he becomes more like himself, and the blood fever lessens in him. You've spoken to him. Where is he, Isabel? You must tell me. Your very life depends on it. My life? Whatever do you mean? The council, Isabel. They've had enough of your brother's vile ways. They've ordered me to destroy him, and if I do not, they've promised to kill you in his stead. Me? She said. What have I done? I've committed no crime. Your very existence is a crime. When I made you, I did not ask their permission. There was no time. You were dying. I did what I had to do, but when you made your brother into a monster and... He was dying, she spat. I did what I had to do. It does not matter, I said, grabbing her arm. For what we have done, they have the right to kill us, but they have promised to spare you, but only if I bring your brother to justice. He is a monster, Isabel. You must see that. Don't you ever listen, Father? She said, tearing herself from my grasp. He's changed. With every passing year, the blood madness recedes. I spoke to him last night. He did not attack, but spoke some few words to me before bolting back into his hidey hole. No, I said, trying to hold my temper. It is you that does not listen. You are blinded by your own guilt. Changed, has he? Tell that to the two innocent people he tore apart last night. and the family of 4 the night before that. He has to die. No, Father, she said, backing away. I can speak to him. I will tell him. I will take him far from here and hide him away. You cannot hide from the council. You won't even try? She said, openly weeping now. For that, I will never forgive you. And just like that, she was gone. Sadly, I sat back down and waited. Her proximity to me had opened our connection once again, and I knew it would now be a simple thing to track her down. But first, I had to give her time to get to her brother, so I could end this thing once and for all. Closing my eyes, I reached out with my vampire awareness. I felt the tendrils of my psyche crawl through the city streets until I touched upon Isabel's panic-stricken thoughts. Show me, I whispered, bringing all of my will to bear, crawling like some insidious demon into my daughter's head, seeing through her eyes. She was by the river, heading towards a large, seemingly abandoned building, with George Washington Bridge gleaming in the moonlight. Quickly I leapt to my feet, and I headed into the street. Before taking to the rooftops, there I ran, using the great speed of the vampire. I seemed to almost fly as I leapt from building to building, sometimes taking to the streets in a blur of motion, undetectable by the bustling mortals before taking to the rooftops again. Isabel's presence shone like a glowing beacon in my mind. In no time at all, I was at the location I had seen through her eyes and was already approaching the abandoned building, where I heard an ear-splitting scream and felt a deep, lancing pain above my heart. "Isabel!" I screamed, feeling her presence fade away. Oh, God. Oh, no! Quickly, I came on the run, throwing open the door and entering the night-shrouded building. The scent of blood was everywhere. Scanning the warehouse floor, I saw nothing, and so headed for a set of nearby stairs, feeling breathless as I drowned in my own panic. Just then, a tittering laugh came sweeping out of the darkness. Too late, Nicholas. Justice has already been served. Jeanette was perched high above me on a rusting beam, smiling obscenely. Jeanette, what have you done? See for yourself, she chuckled. Just a few more steps will take you to your beloved family. No. No, no! I screamed, rushing up the steps. That's where I found them. Not only Sebastian, but my beloved Isabel, too. They were both hanging from meat hooks. Their chests had been torn open, their ribs shattered, and their hearts removed. On Sebastian's face was the same look of haunted rage, somehow seeming pathetic in death. But Isabel, my poor Isabel, looked only tired and sad, like some lost child. No! I cried, falling on my knees before them. Oh, God, no. There is no God, Nicholas, Jeanette said from behind me. And if there was, he would have no mercy for such as us. I felt something building inside me. A rage that set my blood on fire, filling my vision with great red blooms. I will kill you for this, I said, feeling my face become beast-like as the vampire in me ascended. She laughed again, perhaps not sensing the danger she was in or not caring in her arrogance. Their deaths were sanctioned by the council. We knew you would not have the stomach for it, and so they sent me. I'm going to kill you, I said again, rising to my feet. You don't have the power, she sneered. But that was as far as she got. Suddenly I was upon her, my claws digging into the sides of her head as I tore her into her throat. For a moment I thought that I had her, but With a scream of outrage, she cast me from her, sending me flying through the air, where I landed upon the concrete floor. "You're a dead man, Radic," she hissed. "To attack a council member is a death sentence. I will happily bring them your head. I never liked you. You and your soft sentiments, thinking yourself better than the rest of us, watching your beloved family for centuries, like birds in a gilded cage. But now they're all dead. Not to worry. You'll soon be joining them in hell. Come then, bitch. Come if you're coming." With a scream, she rushed at me. She was stronger, but I had more experience. I fought in many wars, battles over the long centuries, and knew how to goad an enemy into a mistake, and my only hope was to live long enough for her to make it. Quickly, I tried to step to the side to use her own momentum against her, but she saw it coming and swiped at me with her razor-sharp claws, shattering my ribs, tearing my flesh. She was behind me now, her claws raking down my back. In desperation, I span around, slashing at her, but she caught my arm, spun me around, sending me flying through the air, where I landed with a crash amongst wooden pallets, splinters flying all about. I heard a scream of agony, and I saw Jeanette staggering towards me, her hands scrabbling at her face, trying to remove the large splinters that had pierced her eye. I knew that was my moment. Act now or die. Through the roar and with the last of my failing strength, I grabbed up a large jagged piece of wood and I ran at her, holding it out before me like some terrible lance. At the last moment, she saw me coming and tried to step aside, throwing me off my aim, but instead of the heart, the stake pierced her stomach. And with all my might, I thrust it upwards. I felt my hand slip inside of her, relishing in the feel of her cold blood as it flowed over my arms. I raised her off her feet. "No!" she cried, beating at my head. "It can't be!" "But it is," I snarled at her, removing the stake and thrusting it through her gaping maw, piercing her brain. She started to thrash and buck wildly, and then I knew she was far from finished. Casting her to the floor, I jumped upon her, thrust my hand upward into her stomach, grabbing onto her shriveled heart. "For the family," I spat in her face, and I tore it free in a welter of blood. Immediately, her body started to steam and shrivel, and in mere seconds she was nothing more than a gray dust under my booted heel. Climbing to my feet, I staggered outside, only to be greeted by the rising sun. For a moment I stood before it, feeling it biting into my skin, boiling my blood. For a second I was tempted to let it take me, to end my suffering, but in the end I was too much of a coward. With a cry, my skin on fire, I leapt into the dark waters of the Hudson River. Extinguishing the flames, I sunk into its murky depths, letting the silt smother me, suffocating me in its cold embrace. I was a hunted thing now, condemned to death, a pariah amongst my own kind. The vampire council would see me dead for what I had done. I closed my eyes as the dreaded sun spilled across the face of the world. I saw my daughter's face. "I will kill them all," I whispered, tasting the bitter waters. It was cold. Cold and bitter, but not as bitter as my heart. A blood tide was coming, and I intended to drink deeply. I intended to drink deeply indeed. I was lying in a lake of blood. Beside me floated my beloved daughter, Isabel. She reached for me and our fingers intertwined. Above us, a cold, heartless moon, surrounded by indifferent stars, shined down, silvering our skin. "Father," she whispered. "Father, look at me." I did as she bid, a smile on my face, so happy to be in her presence once again. "I had a terrible dream," I told her, taking in the glory of her face. I dreamt that you were dead. I am dead, she said sadly. Can't you see? Suddenly, her face began to rot, and she started to scream, her fanged mouth opening impossibly wide, eating up her face in a red ruin, hands shot from beneath her, tearing chunks out of her writhing body. No, I screamed, but she was gone, dragged under the red depths. Now hands also began to grab at me, spinning me around, dragging me under the blood-red surface. There were hundreds of them, thousands, and I realized those poor lost souls were my own victims brought back to some sort of terrible life, eager to exact a righteous retribution. I tried to pull away, but the hands were persistent, calling my name. Nicholas, wake up. The voice was a female, and familiar, echoing through my head. Struggling, I opened my eyes and breathed in cold, filthy water. Above me, the face of a woman, bloated, shining like the moon from my dreams through the murk and gloom. Bambat. She smiled at me then, a look of sadness in her eyes. Time to be up in the world again, Nicholas Radek. How? I pushed my thoughts into her mind. How can it be? You are dead, my love, and I am dreaming once again. A dream within a dream, she answered, pulling me towards the surface. I tried to fight her, wanting to be alone in my sorrow, but she was strong. My mother in darkness. She always had been so much stronger than I, and now she tightened her grip as we broke the surface, rising us higher and higher until we levitated above the water. How? I said, reaching for her face. How are you real? But she said nothing. She moved in a blur of motion, depositing us on the nearby shore, where I shot to my feet, embracing her and kissing her face. She endured this patiently before gently pushing me away. We must talk, Nicholas. The Vampire Council is looking for you and have declared you an outlaw for the murder of Jeanette. I care nothing for their banishment. My joy at her presence was fading now, replaced by a smoldering anger. I thought you long dead. I have mourned your passing for 100 years. I found your letter and your sun-blackened clothes. I ran my hand through your ashes, pulled them to my face, wept over them, and yet here you are, very much alive and well. How did you do it, Babette? Why did you do it? Or have you risen like some terrible phoenix from your own ashes? Am I terrible to you, then? She said, reaching for me, but I backed away. Explain first. She sighed, then sat down upon a nearby rock. I did it for you, Nicholas. I was making you weak. Your love for me made you vulnerable, and you had your family. At some point, you would have had to decide between your mortal descendants and myself. A choice that would have torn you apart, and so I made the decision for you. And is that the only reason? I asked, knowing there was more. No, she said. I was jealous of your devotion to them. I considered hurting them, killing them, but I knew you would never forgive such an atrocity. I was confused and angry, so I decided to leave. But I knew you would follow and try to bring me back to help you watch over these children of your lineage, and so I faked my own death and left you. My family, I sighed, are all dead. It was nothing more than my love for them that inevitably brought about their end. No, Nicholas, she said, drawing closer, compassion heavy in her eyes. You must not blame yourself. It was the council that brought about their destruction. They are envious and cruel. That is why I left the council all those years ago. They live only to serve themselves. They care nothing for the rest of vampire kind. Do you think they cared for 1 second about the mortal lives lost to your ravenous son? No, do not fool yourself, my Nicholas. They only cared about themselves being exposed, for if the humans began to believe in us once again, then who do you think would be the first to go? And now, with the killing of Jeanette, you have challenged their power and authority, and for that, my beloved, they will see you dead. Not if I kill them first, I growled. Nicholas, she sighed, you are like a child screaming into the wind. Jeanette was the least of them. She fucked her way onto the council, like the great whore she always was. Bartholomew and Marius are a different story, especially Marius, for he was old when the world was young. You cannot hope to defeat him. Tell me, Babette, I asked. What do you know of Marius? I sat on a nearby rock, intrigued, now despite myself. Babette followed suit, sitting close by. There have been many rumors surrounding Marius, and I have heard many stories throughout the long years. It is claimed by some that he is the oldest of our kind and father to us all. He has sat on the Vampire Council for as long as anyone can remember. It is as if he has always been here, amongst us. You said the oldest father to us all. Do you mean he is the first, the origin of our kind? A look of annoyance passed across her smooth features at my interruption. Bartholomew certainly seems to think so, she continued. He told me a story once. A story he claims came from Marius himself, but he is a great liar, as are we all. But you tell it anyway, I asked. You want to sit here with all of vampire kind baying for your blood and listen to fairy tales. If there's any truth to this story, it may be of some help in defeating our enemy, and that is worth something at least. She nodded to this, before smoothing down her dress and continuing on with her story. Okay, she sighed. This is what Bartholomew told me all those long nights ago. Many years ago, before the Romans came to the land of Brittany, Marius was the son of a great war chief. Not the first son, a position that would have given him great power, but the fourth son, and far from the apple of his father's eye. He was weak and sickly compared to his ferocious brothers. He had no interest in swordplay, hunting, or bloodletting. He was a dreamer who spent most hours gazing up at the stars and preferring the company of his mother over that of his loud braggart of a father. Now it is said that Marius's village had fallen upon hard times. For 5 years, the crops had failed, and disease and pestilence roamed the land, and the druid priests believed the old god who lived in the earth had abandoned its people. Sacrifices had been made. Every year the blood of men, virgins, and even babes had been offered up to the old god of the grove. But the crops still failed, and Marius's people were close to the edge. And so it was on the eve of the winter solstice that the high priest had come before Marius's father and demanded royal blood to sate the hungry god. Marius's father feared the old god greatly, and with only token resistance, had offered up his youngest son under much protest from his screaming mother. Marius, however, did not protest. For him, this was a noble sacrifice, something he would be remembered for, and a way to help his people, and so he bravely agreed to be sacrificed upon the old one in the ground. The next day, there had been a great feast in Marius's honor. One of the few remaining goats had been bled, and Marius had been given the best of everything. The best food, wine, and women had all been his for the day. It was only as the sun began to set that the revelry settled down, and the priests had come with flaming torches held aloft to take Marius to the sacred grove. The walk had been a long one through the night-darkened forest. Marius began to sober with every step, as fear wormed its way into his guts. By the time they arrived at the grove, he was now fully conscious and in a state of abject terror. Now, the high priest had said, "Come forward," and pointing towards a small crack in the rock face, "You must go there. Inside is a tunnel leading down to where the old god resides. At the bottom you will find an ancient dagger. You must draw your blood to summon the old one, and before you know it, you will be in paradise forever." "Easy to speak of paradise when you are not the one on the altar, isn't it?" Marius huffed. The priest said nothing to this, but offered him a flaming torch. "It is dark inside, and you will need this." Marius took the offered torch and turned away, heading towards his destiny. The inside of the cave was narrow, with stone steps leading down into the winding darkness. The walls were rough-hewn and heavy with chisel marks. As Marius descended, the walls smoothed out, revealing hideous cave paintings that seemed to writhe and undulate in the flickering torchlight. Marius quickly looked away. The images burned in his brain, a story of ages past and sacrifices made in blood to one who was old when the stars were still young. But not once did Marius consider fleeing. He had this duty to perform and was honor-bound to see it through. Deeper and deeper he descended, beginning to fear his guttering torch would go out, leaving him alone in the darkness when suddenly the stairs beneath him stopped, grinding him to a halt. He looked in terror at the cavern before him. The cavern was small, but with a high ceiling from which dripping stalactites hung like jagged teeth. The walls were covered with a strange-looking lichen that let out a sickening green glow, illuminating the cavern floor that was covered with age-old blackened bones. Protruding from the pile of ancient decay was a large well cut of rough-hewn stone, darkened and stained with the spilled lives of countless victims. Upon the edge of this ancient monastery lay an equally looking ancient dagger, and as Marius approached, he noted it was not made from iron, but from white-pitted bone. Reaching down with a shaky hand, he scooped the thing up. It felt incredibly heavy and cold in his hand. This was the gateway. This was how to summon the old god that dwelled, sleeping within the earth. Casting his torch aside, wishing only to get this thing finished, he dragged the blade across the palm of his hand. He hissed in pain as he raised his hand and let his blood fall into the black depths of the ancient well. For a moment, there was nothing. But then the very earth beneath his feet began to shake, and he cried out, falling amongst the ancient bones. Something was coming, racing towards him. He could feel it now, sense its eagerness and terrible greed. From the well came an explosion of foul-smelling water as a giant gray worm suddenly burst forth. Hundreds of crimson eyes burned across its segmented sides where it swayed above him like a hooded leech. Marius screamed and tried to scramble away as the creature opened its gaping maw, revealing a throat lined with hook-like teeth. For a moment, he was sure the thing was going to swallow him whole, but instead, it wrapped him up in its many squirming coils and dragged him screaming into the darkness. Marius began to pray until he realized that he was praying to the very creature that was about to kill him, the old god of the grove. "I am not going to kill you," a voice whispered into his mind like a clinging fog. "You will be my vengeance, a great plague I shall release upon the world, for I am the last of my kind. The infinite made flesh by the prayers of men. My fate is now sealed, as their faith in my kind fades throughout the aching centuries, but through you, my son, something of me shall live on. And with the last of my strength I bequeath unto you the gift of flesh and blood." Darius opened his mouth to scream as the creature's strange flesh began to fill his body, surging down his throat, invading his bleeding ears, enveloping his brain, filling every crevice with its vile, squirming flesh, and even in his delirium of pain he could sense the creature's strange satisfaction and a desire he could not possibly comprehend. This torture seemed to last for an eternity, and Marius wished himself dead 1,000 times as the creature took from him over and over again, before giving something of itself back. At last, after what seemed to Marius 1,000 years, the creature's cruel hooks were withdrawn, and he was gently deposited back onto the chamber floor. For a moment, the creature swayed above him. The light in its many eyes began to fade as it shuddered and trembled. With a bellowing roar, it collapsed beside him, white patches forming over its loathsome hide. The last thing Marius saw before the darkness dragged him under was the loathsome body crumble into dust. "My God," I said, climbing to my feet. "Do you believe it to be true that Marius is the first of us?" She shrugged. "I can only tell you what Bartholomew told me, although he is a great liar, as are we all. But if it's true," I said, taking her hand, "then what do we do?" "Running would seem the obvious choice. Hiding until this all blows over." I laughed then. "You think this will all blow over?" "Sure." She grinned back at me. "In about 1,000 years, but until then, I have arranged transport for us out of this country." "Where? How?" "I had my man book us aboard a ship. A cruise liner, to be precise, headed for England." "England?" I raised a cynical eyebrow. "What's in England?" "Rain, mostly," she replied. "That and a rather large estate I came into some years ago. It is secluded deep in the heart of the country. We can buy a little time there until we figure this thing out. The ship leaves from Boston in 3 days on its return journey to Southampton." "Great," I replied. "A week stuck in a box in the cargo hold." She chuckled at this. "I have booked us first class in a rather expensive suite. Like I said, my man has made all the arrangements. We board in the evening, 9 p.m. to be precise. The company has also been told that we are a wealthy brother and sister suffering from a severe solar urticaria, and are heading for England to try our newly developed treatment. The cruise liner company were very helpful." She laughed again. "They even shuttered and painted the cabin windows for us." I laughed then, and took her into my arms. "Is there anything you didn't think of?" "Sure," she said, her smile wilting. "How to save your life." Six nights later, I stood on the deck of the Ocean Princess. The cold waters of the Atlantic glistening past below, the cold wind biting at my skin. Behind me, a band played, and people laughed and drank a hearty assortment of fruity cocktails and yeast-smelling beers. I myself was in no mood for laughter. This was only the 3rd night of our journey, and already Babette and I had a falling out. It all started when she wanted to feed on one of the passengers, a particularly good-looking young man that had taken her eye. I, of course, had voiced a strong objection, but she had rounded on me, telling me that not all vampires share my moral compass, and she was free to do as she pleased. Eventually, I managed to convince her. "Very well," she had hissed. "Looks like the ship will be blessed free of rats." She stormed out then. The boy had lived to see another day, but an old man had died not more than a few cabins down from us that very same night. The official verdict was one of heart failure, but I knew better. We had not spoken since. "Nicholas," her voice now floated behind me as she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, "let us stop this needless bickering. You have your ways, I have mine. Tell me, have you fed tonight?" "Yes," I answered. "As a matter of fact, I have. A young woman on deck 2. She tasted vaguely of peppermint." "Nicholas!" she exclaimed, shocked. Not to worry, I laughed at her. It was only the smallest of sips, just enough to get by. Did you know there's not a single rat aboard this ship? This modern world is a marvel of sanitation. I wonder, she said, a small smile playing across her bow-shaped mouth. Could the great Nicholas Raddick's moral compass be slipping? I shrugged. Needs met. There really aren't any rats. I looked long and hard. Besides, the girl will come to, no real harm. A good night's sleep and she will be fine. She smiled up at me, linking my arm. Come, I have a gift for you, too, in fact. Taking me by the hand, she led us back to our lavish cabin before locking the door and sitting beside me on the bed. You're strong, Nicholas. Almost an elder yourself, but you're not strong enough for what's to come. I, however, would make you stronger still. I stood quickly. What are you thinking, Babette? You already know the answer, she said, gliding towards me. You must drink from me. Accept my sacrament. Drink my blood and you will know power like you have never known before. But at what cost, Babette? What will I lose in return? What little humanity I have left? Oh, Nicholas, she smiled, gently stroking my face. That part of you that glows so bright attracts me like a moth to flame. Your very presence warms my cold soul and gives me comfort. I love you, Nicholas. I would never seek to destroy the things that make you, you. Now come, she said, letting her dress drop to the floor. Come and partake of my goodness. I looked at her ripe body, feeling the old lust for her return, a lust that burned me up from the inside, a lust you would kill for, sell your very soul for. You said 2 gifts, I said a little breathlessly. Yes, she replied, gliding towards me. The first is my blood. The other is me. I awoke to the sounds of screams. Babette's blood still wet on my lips, my body sore from our lovemaking. Babette was in the doorway. Something had a hold on her, something huge, covered in fur with claw-tipped membranous wings that raked at her naked flesh. Help me, Nicholas, she cried, trying to stave off the thing's gnawing jaws. With a cry, I leapt from my bed, but it was too late. With a final cry of effort, Babette grabbed the creature's jaw and ripped it free before ramming spear-tipped claws into its fur-covered chest and tearing out its blackened heart. It shrieked an ear-piercing scream that collapsed in a smoking heap upon the floor. What in God's name is that? I said, looking down at the fallen monstrosity. One of the Forsaken, she answered, throwing on her clothes. Her wounds already began to heal. Forsaken, I said, not suddenly aware of the smell of burning in the air and the sound of distant screams. Wake up, Babette said, slapping me across the face hard. Sounds like they're all over the ship. Marius must have wanted you badly to release such monstrosities. But how did he find us so soon? I don't know, and right now I don't care. The ship is going down. Marius will leave no witnesses behind. Every man, woman, and child above this ship is dead. We have to get to life rafts and abandon ship before more of these things find us. Come, she said. Let us get above deck and get out of here. As we entered the hallway, a woman came screaming past, a bloody bundle in her arms. Hot on her heels was one of the bat-like monstrosities. It saw us and veered off, coming straight for us. Babette quickly stepped aside. This one is yours, Lord Raddick. Time to use the strength I've gifted you. There was no time to protest. The thing was almost upon us, hell-bent on its destruction. Ducking low, I avoided its first clumsy swing, and coming up behind it, slammed it hard into the wall before wrapping my arms around its neck, meaning to drag it backwards, but instead, I tore its head completely free, drowning myself in its vile blood. Very good, Nicholas, Babette said, looking into my stunned face. Your new powers will take a little getting used to, but it's a good start. Now, let's get moving before we end up swimming to England. In no time at all, we were back on deck, taking in the devastation all around us. Everywhere, there were dead bodies reduced to quivering hunks of flesh. Torn metal and shattered glass lay all about. Some few survivors ran here and there, shocked and panic-stricken, but They were easily picked off by the bat-like horrors Babette had called the Forsaken. There you are. A dark voice crawled out of the shadows. It was Bartholomew leaning casually against the ship's railing, seeming to enjoy the slaughter all about him. When Babette stepped out from behind me, his eyes widened somewhat before his casual demeanor was slimmed back into place. Lady Babette, we should have known you would come to save your little pet. Pet, she said, looking around at the devastation. I would say it was you who's let your pets off the leash. He bristled at this. These abominations are nothing to do with me. These are Marius's creatures, not mine. We use them to track you, Nicholas, just like a sort of psychic hound dog. It took them some time, but now here we are. And what about these people? I demanded. He shrugged. They were hungry, so I fed them, he said with an evil grin. When they're finished and you are dead, we'll sink the ship and fly back home. Another ship, sadly, lost at sea. Tell me, Babette, have you learned the power of flight yet? That's when I knew his whole casual facade was a lie. He was nervous of her power, and I wondered who was the strongest of the two, and if Babette shared her blood with me. Had it weakened her at all? I learned to fly many years ago, Bartholomew, although I prefer a plane when I can manage it. So tell me, she said, circling him. What now? Now? He said, never taking his eyes off her. Your protege dies for the murder of Jeanette. The only question is if you're willing to join him. You cannot hope to stand against myself and the Forsaken. Stand aside. I promise to make it quick and painless. Oppose me, and you shall both suffer 1,000 deaths before the sun rises. You know me, Babette, he said, looking her up and down slowly. You know what I can do. How many times have I tasted your sweet flesh? How many times have I flogged it and sliced it? How many times have you licked your own blood from my skin? You talk of pets, but there was one time you were mine and Marius's. Such fun we had together. Perhaps I can persuade Marius to give you back to me now that we have lost our precious Jeanette. Well then, she laughed, you make it a simple choice. I will never be at your mercy again. Kill him and be done with it. The whole thing is beginning to bore me, and the night grows short. Do not try to trick me, Babette, Bartholomew growled. I am no fool. There's no trick, Babette said, stepping aside. I won't risk my life for his. He is one of many playthings I have made over these long centuries, and I am sure there will be many others along the way. Just make it quick and painless, as you promised. For a minute he just stood there, looking at her as if weighing up her words. Okay, he said. I have a better idea. You kill him instead. She sighed deeply. As you will. Sorry, my love, she said, pacing towards me. But you're just not worth it. I tried to back away, but she so suddenly had me by the throat, her razor-sharp nails piercing my flesh. Behind her, Bartholomew began to laugh uproariously. Sorry, he grinned at me, but this is going to hurt somewhat. Suddenly she spun around and flung me with all of her might at the laughing Bartholomew, who I crashed into with bone-breaking force, smashing the steel railing behind us, sending us both hurtling into the frozen sea. I was falling now, falling through the inky black darkness. Above me was some kind of maelstrom. It took my vampire eyes a moment to adjust to what I really was seeing, but above me, Babette and Bartholomew were locked in a deadly embrace, each tearing at one another with fang and claw, the water around them turning crimson as each fought to best the other. Feeling my bones beginning to heal and re-knit, I swam upwards, kicking, grabbing hold of Bartholomew's leg, but he brought his other foot down upon my head, trying to kick me away. Still, I grabbed at him, clawing my way up his back as Babette hammered at him, trying to free herself from his deadly embrace. When I reached his neck, I threw my hands around it and leaned back, my knee against him as I tried to tear his head free. I felt bones groan and tendons snap, but even with Babette's blood, I simply did not have the power. Out of sheer desperation, I tore into his throat, locking onto him. I felt the vibration of his scream as Babette did the same, pinning his arms to his side, the other arm flailing at me, but he was growing weak now, and I managed to catch it up and pin it between us. Suddenly, we were heading downward at incredible speeds, and I tried not to cry out as pressure built until I was sure it would crush my skull, sending my brain squirting from my ears. Yet still we went deeper, Babette driving us downward as I looked on in horror as she tore Bartholomew's arms away, and then his leg before rudely pushing him aside. We hit the ocean floor. There she continued her grisly work, pulling his other arm and leg away like some calloused child tearing a butterfly's wings. I thought she would surely finish him then, but she did not. Instead, she thrust the body downward onto the seafloor, over and over again, ramming it through the earth, burying it in silt, mud, and stone until it was completely gone. Buried under the seaweed-strewn wreckage. Taking my hand, we swam upward, flying through the water at great speeds. Bartholomew's blood was working on me now, and I felt stronger than I had ever felt before. We broke the surface, but carried on upward into the air, Babette holding me tight in her embrace. Below us, the ocean liner burned, overwhelmed with flames. All those people, I whispered into her ear, are dead because of me. No, she said, turning us away from the scene. It was the council who brought such wrath upon them. They are no longer fit to serve. I said nothing to this. I was tired, more tired than I had ever been in my long, long life. The sound of the ocean was soothing, and Babette's embrace a comfort. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I knew we were back on dry land, where I was dumped unceremoniously onto the ground. Glad you enjoyed your nap, Nicholas. But the sun is beginning to rise and we need to find shelter. Where are we? I asked, looking around at what seemed like endless green fields. Cornwall would be my best guess, she replied. You don't know? No, Nicholas. Escaping a blazing inferno while being chased by mutant vampire bats, while duking it out with a master vampire in the depths of the ocean takes it out on a person. We are lucky I managed to make it to landfall at all. Now stop asking stupid questions and get up. We have to find a place to spend the day. Come, she said, marching away. There must be something around here. The something ended up being an old crumbling barn, where we buried ourselves in a moldy, wet haystack. Can I ask you something? I said, feeling my body become numb as the sun broached the horizon. Why did you not kill Bartholomew? Why just bury him? Hide him away like that? Leverage, she yawned. Marius will want his little plaything back. Plaything? I whispered, feeling the life drain from my body as the sun spilled across the land. Yes, Babette breathed. You have much to learn, my love, so much to learn. But her words trailed away as the darkness sucked us under. I was dreaming. I was floating in a great lake of blood. A hand clasped mine, and I turned, smiling, expecting to see my daughter, Isabel, floating beside me, but instead I stared into the grinning face of Marius. I will find you, Nicholas Raddick, keeper of the family. I will find you, and when I do, he smiled, revealing a split tongue that squirmed in the jagged cavern of his mouth. When I do, I will tear out your fucking soul. Suddenly his hand shot out from under me, dragging me down. There were hundreds of them, thousands, all in chains, their eyes gouged out, their throats torn open, and I realized to my horror that this was all that was left of my family. Generation after generation of my descendants, tortured and condemned to this hell. My hair was suddenly seized, and my head broke the surface. For the family, Marius whispered into my ears, and suddenly the lake of blood became a lake of fire. I began to scream as the flames took hold. I screamed long and loud. In the end, I screamed loud enough to wake the dead. I awoke to a strange vampire grinning down at me. The boy was young, perhaps no more than 20 when he died. He was a handsome youth, and not long dead. I could still smell the human blood that coursed through his veins. "Wake up, sleepyhead," he tittered. "My mistress Babette is waiting for you in the car." I ignored his words and sat up, brushing damp hay from my shoulders. The boy backed away, looking me up and down as I climbed to my feet. "Where's Babette? And how is it that you've come to be here?" "I just told you," he said, turning his back on me and heading outside. "She's waiting for you in the car." I followed the youth out, not liking the arrogance of his swagger and even less his dismissive tone. The night was star-shot as I emerged, a full moon sailing overhead. Nearby, a limousine sat, engine idling, a long, sleek black machine, almost panther-like in the darkness. The youth went to the side door and opened it with a flourish. "Come, Nicholas," Babette's voice floated from within. "We don't have all night." "Yes, Nicholas," the boy said, his grin getting wider. "Please do get in." I ignored him. I climbed inside and sat beside Babette, who even in her filthy dress sat like a queen amongst the soft leather and gold trappings. "I take it he's one of yours," I said, nodding towards the boy who was now climbed into the front seat and started the engine. "Take us home, Sebastian," she said, before pressing a small button, separating the front of the car from the rear with smoky glass, before turning her attention back to me. "Yes, he's one of mine. I found him droll and entertaining once. Now he's my driver." "And how is it he happened to find us here in the arce end of nowhere?" I asked, trying to keep the suspicion from my voice. "I happened to be up with the setting sun," she said, arching an eyebrow. "You seem tired, so I let you sleep on while I had a quick look around. I just so happened to come across a farmhouse. The people inside were kind enough to let me use their phone, so I called Sebastian and had him come pick us up." "Really?" I said, taking in the rosiness of her cheeks. "And where are those people now?" "They're dead," she said in a cold voice, her eyes never leaving mine. "I drained them dry, Nicholas. And I'll have none of your judgment. Do you think it was an easy thing to do, to defeat Bartholomew, then fly us across half an ocean, the sun hot on our heels, already weak from the blood I had bequeathed you? No, my Nicholas, it almost killed me. I had to feed to live. It was them or me. Oh, would you prefer the lives of two mortals over my own?" "You know I would not. You told me many times our moral compass is not the same, and I am far from your keeper." "You keep my heart, Nicholas," she said, her voice softening now. "We are in this together, you and I. For what I did to Bartholomew, Marius will have my head, just as much as your own. We are fugitives together." "For that I am truly sorry, Babette," I said, taking her hand, glad that she did not pull away from me. "It is of no mind. It was I that sought you out and came to your aid. The tyranny of the council must be stopped. Marius must be stopped." "But how?" I asked her, desperate for some kind of answer. "That, my love," she said, turning from me and looking deep into the night, "is a question to which I have no answer." The rest of the journey was spent in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts until at last we turned down a long gated driveway that opened up to reveal a large mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns. "Welcome to my home," Babette said, turning from the window as we pulled into the driveway. "Where are we?" I asked, taking in the splendor of this place. "Devon," she replied. "This is Jenner's Folly. It once belonged to my husband. After his passing, it became mine. Your husband? I gaped at her. You were married to a mortal? Yes, as a matter of fact I was. A very wealthy one. And he knew what you were? Of course, she said, taking my hand and leading me towards the house. He was none too pure himself, dashing, charismatic and handsome, but not too pure. In fact, he was a criminal mastermind, and the head of a rather large criminal enterprise. My nocturnal activities bothered him not at all. In fact, he had quite a few enemies that he was happy to be rid of. I burst out laughing then. I simply couldn't help myself. You were a hitman, a killer for the mob. She looked startled then, but soon began to laugh herself. I never thought of it quite like that, she said, opening the door and stepping inside. It was more of a case of mutually satisfying arrangement. She stopped, suddenly noticing that I was no longer beside her, before turning and grinning at me slyly. Ah, I forgot you can't come in without my invitation. But the smile fell from her face when she saw my forlorn expression. What is it, Nicholas? Do you think I would leave you outside to rot? By all means, do come in. But I hesitated in the doorway. There is always something, isn't there, Babette? Something that reminds us that we are not human. Gently she took my arm and pulled me into her embrace. You've lost much, my love. Your family was all that anchored you to your mortal self. With their death, I fear you feel the long years of your immortality pushing down upon you. Come, she said, guiding me into a nearby room where a roaring fire glowed in the hearth. Sit down. I have something for you. She was gone for some time before returning where I dozed by the soft fire's glow. With her was a beautiful girl, or at least she would have been, if not for the scar that ran across her face, from her right eye across the bridge of her nose before petering out on her left cheek. This is Angela. She was a homeless waif when I took her in. Now we have an arrangement. She provides me with a little blood now and again, and I give her a home. Another mutually beneficial arrangement? I asked, sitting up straighter. She shrugged. It is what it is, and you need to feed, Nicholas. Although, you will find with Bartholomew's blood in you, not so much as you once did. Oh, and Angela, she said, turning to leave. He is mine. He only needs your blood and nothing more. Yes, Babette, the girl smiled. Of course. After Babette was gone, the girl slinked over to me, all swaying hips. Her dark eyes held sensual promise. My, she whispered, sliding onto my knee. You are quite the handsome one. You make Sebastian look positively plain. What do you know of him? I asked, stroking her fine silk hair. She shivered at my touch, her breath coming a little faster. Not much. He was here when I first came into this place, when I was no more than a child. He was still Babette's plaything then, before he fell out of favor. And why did he fall out of favor? This, for a start, she said, tracing one delicate finger down her scarred face. I was nearly 20 by then, and had finally found my way into Babette's bed after many years of trying, she giggled. But Sebastian became jealous and attacked me, giving me this. After that, neither of us saw her bed again, and Sebastian was demoted to General Dog's Body and I, she said, snuggling closer. A gift for guests. You must hate him very much for what he's done to you, I said, brushing the hair from her pulsing throat. At first, yes. But our banishment from the great lady's bedroom actually served to draw us closer together. Now there's peace between us. Perhaps even fondness. But I was no longer listening. All I could see was the deep throbbing pulse of her throat and the rich smell of her flesh. So young, so full of life. Gently, I bit into her. As soon as her blood hit my mouth, I knew I was lost. A great hunger swelled within me. I crushed her in my embrace, drinking her up, swallowing her life in huge, thirsty gulps, but suddenly she was gone, and Sebastian's snarling face was before me. In his hand, he held an iron poker, grabbing up from the fireplace, which he now sent sailing towards my heart. With a cry, I pistoned my leg forward, catching him hard in the chest. He flew backwards, crashing to a large oak desk and onto the wall with bone-shattering force. I thought that would be the end of it, but instantly he was back on his feet, and I realized he and Babette shared more with this youngling than just her bed. He smiled at me, then, as if perhaps reading something of my thoughts. "Oh yes, Nicholas," he laughed. "I have tasted the blood of the goddess. She's made me strong. You nearly killed our beloved Angela, and for that, I'll have your head." That said, he charged a blur of motion, but I had tasted the blood of Bartholomew, and to me, his movements were nothing more than that of a clumsy child. As he came on, I simply stood aside, grabbing up his slashing arm and using his own wild momentum against him. I threw him screaming into the roaring fire. Suddenly, Babette was amongst us, snarling and cursing, as Sebastian flung himself free from the fire's burning embrace. As his clothes and hair a raging inferno, howling in pain, he rolled back and forth across the deep carpeted floor, extinguishing the lapping flames. "Enough!" Babette screeched, shoving me hard in the chest, meaning to thrust me back into the chair, but her eyes widened in surprise when she realized she could not budge me. Cursing, she turned to Sebastian, who lay dazed upon the floor, his burnt flesh already beginning to knit and heal. "God curse you!" she shrieked at him, grabbing him by the back of the neck and dragging him across the room. "If it wasn't for these damnable killings, I would banish you from my house forever. But you will pay for this, Sebastian. Oh, you will pay." I followed on a little ways behind, feeling somewhat guilty now. "Babette," I tried to speak to her. "It was my fault. He was only trying to defend the girl. My hunger got the better of me." "Nonsense!" she hissed at me, her face feral. "He doesn't give a tinker's fuck for the girl, or anyone else. He wanted you out of the way is all. Do you know how many times he's nearly killed her himself?" She slammed open a wooden door that led down to the basement. "I was a fool to give him the dark kiss, but I was mourning my husband at the time, and he damn well knew it. Didn't you?" she said, shaking him roughly. "Well, I have had enough of your games and your arrogance. I am mistress here, and now you will be punished." "No, mistress!" Sebastian screamed as he saw the metal coffin before him. "Please, mistress, not that, anything but that!" Suddenly, she released him, and he staggered away, never taking his eyes from her face. "Get in," she commanded. "Get in now, or it ends for you right here and now. I created you, and I can end you." Sebastian looked at me, as if seeking help, but looked away, knowing better than to cross Babette when her temper was up. It didn't happen often, but when it did, it was best to stand clear until she settled back down. "Now, Sebastian!" she screamed, reaching for him. But he quickly stepped out of the way, throwing himself inside the waiting box. Without a moment's hesitation, she slammed the lid closed on his slumped-over form before donning a pair of heavy work gloves and wrapping the whole thing in silver chains. "Babette," I tried again. "Be still, Lord Raddock." She turned to me. "If the girl dies, I will be wrathful with you. Now get yourself to your room. The sun will be upon us soon. There are many rooms on the second floor. Find one, stay in it. I don't even want to look at you until tomorrow night." With a sigh, I slinked away, noting much to my relief that Angela's heart was still beating strong as I passed her form, not quite daring to interfere with her. I headed upstairs, and there I found a large room with rich furnishings and heavy drapes. Slowly I ripped off my clothes and climbed into a large bed before falling into a deep sleep. I dreamed of glowing red eyes, Marius's red eyes, searching for us through an eternity of endless nights. I awoke with the setting sun, finding fresh clothes laid out neatly at the bottom of my bed. There was also a crystal decanter and a single glass laid out on the bedside table. I reached for it, savoring the rich, coppery aroma of Babette's blood, knowing this was a kind of peace offering between us. Grateful, I swallowed it down, making sure not to leave a single drop, so as not to imply an insult. After I finished, I quickly got dressed into an expensive black suit and burgundy tie before heading downstairs. I found Babette in the library, sat on a rich leather sofa, the girl Angela by her side. As I entered, I noticed how pale she looked at the crackling firelight, and how she winced at my approach. Scared of me now. With a sigh, I sat in a high-backed chair opposite the duo. "Angela," I said in a low voice, "you must forgive me. I never meant to hurt you. I'm going through some changes." "I've explained all," Babette interrupted smoothly, "and Angela forgives you. Don't you, my love?" "Of course," the girl smiled, but that smile never quite reached her eyes, and it hurt my heart to see it. "You have my thanks, Angela," I smiled back at her, "and my word, it shall never happen again." "Good," Babette smiled. "Now we are all friends again." "What of Sebastian?" the girl asked. "What of him?" Babette smiled at her dangerously. The girl swallowed hard, but continued. "Forgive me, mistress, but how long must he stay locked down there?" "Until I decide he has learned his lesson, but Sebastian is a slow learner, and so I'm afraid it may take some time." "Now run along and play. Nicholas and I have much to discuss." The girl knew she was treading on dangerous ground, and so quickly did as she was bid, virtually skittering from the room. "How did you sleep, Nicholas?" She smiled at me. "I had bad dreams." She waved them away. "Don't we all? We must talk, Nicholas." "Yes, Babette. Among all that chaos last night, I heard you mention something about a series of killings. What did you mean by that?" "I was just coming to it," she retorted hotly. "If you would ever let me finish a damnable sentence." "Forgive me, great lady." I stood, bowing like a quarter. "Oh, do sit down. You're impossible to stay mad at." "That's why you love me," I grinned, wiggling my eyebrows at her seductively. It did my heart good to see that I could still make her blush like a milkmaid. "Stop that," she chuckled, slapping me on the knee playfully. "We must talk. I need your help, Nicholas. There's something going on that puts my life here in danger." "You mean other than Marius?" "We will deal with Marius when the time comes, but for now, I don't intend to just sit around here waiting for him to make his appearance." I suddenly realized she was scared. Whatever business this was, she was using it to take her mind from the inevitable fight ahead. "There's a small town not far from here, by the name of Hansberry. For over a month now, people have turned up missing or dead, their throats torn open. The local newspaper has started to call them the vampire murders. I've done everything in my considerable power to keep it out of the mainstream press. I've called in 100 favors, made 1,000 bribes, and even threatened the penalty of death to conceal this outrage, but that can only last so long. Something must be done, and quickly." "What do you think it is? A rogue vampire?" "That would be my guess. Or a blood-crazed revenant like your poor, misbegotten son." "That could explain it," I said, sitting back, my mind racing. "But that wouldn't explain the missing people. A blood fiend like my son would not steal people away, he would simply have torn them to pieces. So where does that leave us?" "That's why we're going to town, Nicholas. To see crazy Maureen. Grab your coat, my love. We're going on a little adventure." We walked through the night, down narrow tree-laden country lanes, the moon full and bright. "So, are you going to tell me who this Maureen is, or are we going to play 20 questions?" "She's a drunk," she replied, taking my arm. "A drunk and a powerful psychic." "A drunken psychic. That sounds helpful." "Don't mock her, Nicholas," she rounded on me. "She has a great power. She drinks only to numb her heightened senses. Her gift has made her a pariah amongst her own kind. She lives in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, I help her out from time to time. Now it's her turn to help us. I pulled her up short. Babette, does she know what you are? What we are? Yes, she replied, her eyes silver in the moonlight. She knows. Could all this be something to do with her? She laughed then. Oh no, Nicholas, not her. You will understand when you see her. 30 minutes later, we stood outside of a small thatched roof cottage, all white paint and lead-lined windows. Babette raised her hand to knock, but the door was pulled open before the blow landed. A woman stood in the doorway. She could have been anywhere from 40 to 60. Her hair was black and streaked with gray, and she wore dark glasses that covered much of her face. Babette, she whispered, pulling her scruffy-looking cardigan tighter around her, as if to ward off a chill. I've been expecting you. Please do come in, she said, stepping to one side. I'm afraid my friend here will need an invite, Babette said, nodding towards me. The woman did not track her movement, and I suddenly realized she was blind. Come in then, Nicholas Radek. You know of me, I said, startled. Some of us do not need eyes to see, she replied, as we slid past her and into a homely-looking kitchen. Please, sit, she said, shuffling in behind us. We did as she asked, waiting until she was more comfortably seated, a slight way across from us. What do you require of me, Babette? I need your help. I know it pains you to use your gift, but people are dying. You mean the vampire killings? Yes, Babette continued. I need to find this creature and kill it before its bloodthirsty nature leads the authorities to my door. Will you help me? Of course, she said more softly. I owe you everything. Even the very roof over my head is down to you. Now give me your hand, and we shall see what we shall see. Babette reached for her, and as soon as their hands met, the woman called Maureen spasmed and convulsed, her eyes rolling back in her head. Jealousy! She shrieked. Jealousy and hate drives their master. Legion, for they are many in the cold blackness. They crave in the stone prison, deep in the earth, the sound of the ocean roars around the dead man's curve. Babette pulled her hand free, and the other woman slumped down, seemingly exhausted. Dead Man's Curve, Babette gaped at me. I know that place. It's on the coast, not far from here, but there's no cave there, only an old tin mine. That's it, then. Whoever's doing these things must be hiding there, I said, leaping to my feet. Can you find this place? Oh, yes, she grinned. The night is still young, Nicholas. Shall we go pay them a visit? What of her? I said, pointing to the seemingly sleeping woman. She will be fine. A slight headache in the morning, nothing more, she said, heading for the door. I hurried after her, my arm brushing past the sleeping woman who jerked upright, seizing my arm in a frenzied death grip of froth pouring from her lips. Hail, Nicholas Radek, keeper of the family that is no more. Your path ends where his did begin. Look for your foe in the dead forest at the edge of the sea. There your fate will be decided. That said, she slumped back down, unconscious. Nicholas! Babette called from outside. Are you coming or no? Yes. I stalked out into the darkness. Babette. She spoke to me. I heard it, Nicholas. We will speak more of that later, but for now, one thing at a time. I think she spoke of Marius. Nicholas! She turned to me, her eyes flashing. Marius is not here, not yet. The problem of mine is right before us. Please, she implored. Please, let's not speak of Marius now. Very well, my love, I said, drawing her onto my embrace. We shall not speak of him now. Good, she smiled up at me. Let's go. We shot up into the night. Time for you to sink or swim, my love, she said, as we soared over the rugged coastline, and just like that, she dropped me. With a cry, I plummeted towards the earth, cartwheeling out of control. Use your will! Her voice boomed in my mind. Will it, and it will be so! Even in the depths of my terror, I knew she spoke the truth, and I brought myself my will to bear, and stopped my dizzying descent, and just sat there, floating on a current of air. Up, I commanded, concentrating on Babette, who soared high above me, and then I was beside her, soaring, laughing, as the cold wind buffeted me to and fro. Well, look at you. No cape or anything, she tittered. How did you know I could do it? I asked her, our fingers entwining. You have my blood coursing through your veins, and the blood of Bartholomew. You are more powerful than you can ever begin to comprehend. Now come, let us find this transgressor, and put paid to him once and for all. 10 minutes later, we were stood outside the old abandoned mine shaft that rose high upon the cliffs of a rocky outcrop named Dead Man's Curve. There was fresh blood spattered on the walls, close to an iron mine cap that had been torn from its moorings. I think this is the place, I said, trying to peer into the gloom, the sound of the ocean crashing in my ears. You don't say, Babette said somewhat haughtily. Please do come in, a voice echoed to us out of the darkness. We have been expecting you. Babette's eyes widened in shock. It can't be, she growled, stalking inside. I followed hot on her heel. For a moment we were in a narrow tunnel, the faint glow of flickering firelight up ahead. The tunnel opened into a vaulted chamber. Sat upon the floor by a small campfire that cast shadows around the room was Sebastian, a dead child in his arms. At our approach he stood, the dead body falling to the floor like a broken doll. Welcome! He smiled at us through bloody teeth. How are you here? Babette grated, her entire body vibrating with rage. I locked you away! And I let him out. A musical voice drifted out of the darkness as Angela stepped into the firelight, her eyes crimson orbs, her mouth stained with blood. Oh, Angela, Babette shook her head sadly. What has he done to you? But you never would, the girl spat at him. How many nights did I beg you, implore you to give me the blood kiss so I could be with you forever? But you denied me. You were happy to watch me grow old and die. But Sebastian promised me eternal life if I would help him. Help him do what? I said, standing by Babette's side. Build an army, Sebastian laughed. We hide in the shadows when we should be the rulers of this world. Behold, he said, throwing up his arms. My children! And just then, as if hearing some unknown summons, a whole multitude of vampires came sleeking out of the darkness, but they were horribly mutated, some impossibly thin, scabrous, others twisted and malformed. Revenants, Babette gasped. Blood berserkers. Not anymore, Sebastian laughed. Oh, they were a little unruly at first, but I soon realized my blood was too weak to make more of our kind. Only these things. So I fooled you into giving me yours. And now they obey my every command. I will kill you for this, Babette grated, stalking towards him. Oh, I don't think so, Sebastian said, signaling the horde. Just then the top of the cave exploded in a shower of rocks and dust as Marius made his grand entrance. Not interrupting, am I? He grinned, flicking the dust from his immaculately tailored suit. I need a word with you, Lord Radek. He glared at me with crimson eyes. Well, 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 Sebastian grinned, stalking towards him. What do we have here? A new player in town. Marius looked him up and down. With a bored sigh, casually tore his head free from his shoulders in a shower of blood, bone, and gristle. No! Angela screamed, but soon was silenced as the vampire horde, now free from any restraint, reverted back to its crazed, bloodthirsty nature. His death was fast compared to what I am going to do to you, Nicholas Radek. Marius grinned. And Babette, he said, nodding his head sadly, your betrayal hurts me the most. Do you remember the fun we used to have together, you, I, and Bartholomew? All those blood-soaked nights. Oh, the things we used to do to your body. We will have those times again." He licked his lips seductively. "Only this time, you will find no pleasure in it. I guarantee that." "It was never a pleasure," Babette hissed at him, quickly backing away. "I would rather die than suffer your embrace again." "Oh, you will," he grinned at her, "but at my choosing, not yours." "You will not touch her," I said, standing before her. He was just about to answer when one of the blood-crazed creatures leapt upon his back, its teeth sinking into his shoulder. He screamed and cast it away, but now the entire horde descended upon him, driving him under the combined weight. "Come," Babette grabbed me by the arm. "This won't hold him for long." "We should attack him now while he's down," I yelled at her face. "Not here. Remember Maureen's words, in the dead forest." "I don't know what that means." "But I do," she yelled. Taking my arm, she flung me outside and caught me up in her embrace, flying us upwards into the night sky, the wind buffeting us as we headed north. "Where are we going?" I asked, breaking free of her and gliding by her side as we sped onwards. "To Lulworth Cave," she replied, her hair rippling in the cold night wind. "Why there?" I asked, trying hard to keep up. "The dead forest can only mean one place. The Jurassic Forest. It's a stretch of coast near Lulworth, in Dorset. The coastline is dotted with petrified remains of long-dead forests. Remember the story I told you of Marius' creation? The forest in the cave by the ocean. The old well, home to the old demon in the ground." "Your path ends where his did begin." I repeated the words of the old prophet. "But how can you know this is the right place?" "You forget I've tasted the blood of Marius. When he made me a council member, even a single drop increased my power 100-fold. "The blood memories. You saw it through the blood memories." "Yes." Her voice almost stolen by the growing wind. "And we have visited the area before on our many travels together as a council. Many times Marius hinted that this was the place of his creation, and in that mocking tone of his. "Still, it's a long shot," I screamed over the freezing wind. She shrugged. "Looks like that's all we have. It's as good a place to make our final stand." Moments later we were heading down, landing on the abandoned coast. A small village alight in the distance. "This is it," she said, as I looked around in wonder at the petrified tree stumps and broken logs. "The Jurassic Coast, also known as the Dead Forest." Babette sighed. Just then Marius crash-landed right beside us, striking Babette with a glancing blow, sending her flying through the air and crashing far out into the ocean. Before I could even turn, he grabbed me by the back of the neck in a crushing embrace. "Curious, are you?" he growled at me. "Come then, I'll show you the beginning of my creation, before I end your miserable life." He was running now, the sea and rocks a blur as he sped on, holding me at an arm's length as if I weighed nothing, paralyzed in his terrible, crushing embrace. At last we came to a screeching halt. There he struck the side of the rearing cliff, causing a huge landslide, revealing a narrow cave entrance beneath the centuries of dirt and clay. With terrifying force, he thrust me through the narrow entrance. I howled in pain as the jagged stone tore at my flesh. Marius followed me through the stone crumbling before him. He cast me away, sending me rolling down the sloping floor until my head connected hard against the moss-covered stone. I stood, my vampire eyes adjusting to the darkness. I was standing in a vast cavern, covered in strange lichen that emitted a sickly yellow glow. Behind me was a vast well-like opening, surrounded with decaying stone, and I remember the story of the great worm-like creature that had bequeathed its tainted blood onto Marius. The last hateful act of a dying god the world had long since abandoned. "How do you like it, Nicholas?" Marius mocked. "The birthplace of our kind. I do you a great honor by killing you here." "Did you feel honored?" I growled at him. "When the parasite stole your innocence, violating you, polluting your very essence with its vileness." He moved then, a blur of motion smashing me hard across the face, sending me crashing into the cavern walls with bone-breaking force. Instantly, my body began to knit and heal as I leapt to my feet. Marius's eyes narrowed. I see Bartholomew's blood has made you stronger, but it won't be enough, Nicholas. Not by half. I charged him then, hoping to take him by surprise, but he didn't move as I leapt upon him, trying to sink my fangs into his neck. But I couldn't so much as pierce the skin. It was like trying to bite into marble. Laughing, he grabbed me by my throat and slammed me back down, breaking my spine, crushing the back of my skull as he placed a booted foot upon my chest, pinning me in place. I could kill you now, but I will break your spirit first, and only when you kneel before me and beg for death will I end your suffering. Fuck you! I spat my blood into his face. With a cry of outrage, he began to beat me. After many hours, and all manner of outrage inflicted upon my battered body, he would command me to kneel. But I would not, and so it would begin again. How long this lasted, I could not say. Hours, days. How do you measure time in your own personal hell? I only knew that Marius himself was becoming exhausted, his great strength starting to wane. As he placed his foot upon my head, I whimpered, feeling my skull starting to creak. Kneel before me, he shrieked. Why do you defy me? Why won't you surrender? You killed my family, I gasped. For a moment the pressure increased, and then he staggered away screaming, tearing at the walls, hammering his fist into the stone until the ceiling began to shake, and I feared we would both be buried alive in this terrible place. He turned to me then, and I was shocked to see tears standing out in his eyes. Your family, he sighed. As I propped myself up against the stone wall, my body beginning to heal. Your God-cursed family! He sat down heavily, his head hanging between his knees. He stayed like that for some time. The only sound the muted crash of the ocean and the sighing of the wind. I wasn't always this way, Nicholas. He spoke at first, his voice filled with sorrow. At one point, I was much like you. I had a family of my own. I stayed with them for a while, for centuries. I watched over them, the descendants of my little tribe. I watched them as they grew old, withered, died. I thought I would go mad with heartbreak and grief. And so I turned away from them only to take lovers, make friends who all turned to dust, or begged me for the dark kiss, thinking it's a great gift instead of a great curse, of which it really is. I wandered for centuries, making my home in great cities only to see them burned to the ground, their people put to the sword. I watched on in horror as the humans slaughtered millions. In the name of their god, or for money, land, power, until at last, my heart broken with the pain of it all, I walked into the sun. I burned my flesh, over and over again, only for me to rise again the next night like some terrible phoenix from my own ashes. I threw myself from the tallest buildings, only to have my flesh and bones heal in an instant. I tried everything imaginable to end my suffering, and still I would not die. I knew then the only way to go on was to harden my heart against the world and everything in it, and so I became the monster that you now see before you. And then you came along, Radek. You with your endless love for your children, even for your insane son. Willing to suffer for them, to die for them, always fighting, never surrendering. Your devotion to them. You made me feel again, Nicholas. And I hated you for it. I thought if I destroyed everything you love, you would turn into the soulless monster I'd become. But you did not. You would not. And so, Nicholas, you have defeated me without even drawing your sword. What will you do now? I asked, fearing him yet pitying him at the same time. I will end it once and for all. How? I asked, climbing to my feet. You said yourself you cannot die. Oh, but I can, he said, dragging an ancient-looking dagger from under the back of his jacket and looking at it fondly. I came back to this place some few hundred years ago. Perhaps I was feeling nostalgic, maybe just a little bored. I found this here, he said, placing the blade upon the side of the well. Exactly where I left it over a millennia ago. Can you imagine my surprise when I scooped it up and it did this? He said, drawing the blade across the palm of his hand. Instantly the skin split open and his blood began to flow. Do you know how long it's been since I saw my own blood? Why does it not heal? I do not know, he said, gently pulling away. Perhaps it's because this blade is the last thing that tasted my mortal flesh. Perhaps it's a reprieve from God, or perhaps even the devil himself. If you have had it all this time, then why haven't I ended it? He shook his head softly. Because by the time I found it again, my heart had already turned to stone. But you've made it bleed again. And that I cannot stand, he said, grabbing my shaking wrist and raising the blade towards his throat. And so, you may have your vengeance, Nicholas. But there is price to vengeance. Lord Radok. What price? I whispered into his face. The king is dead. He laughed at me. Long live the king. And that said, he dragged me forward, burying the blade on his throat. Cold blood sprang across my face. I opened my mouth to scream and tried to pull away, but he held me fast. His blood pouring down my throat, pushing up my nose, blinding my eyes, soaking into every pore like some terrible osmosis. At last he fell away. His body, a wasted husk. What have you done? I whispered, feeling a terrible power flow through my veins. Oh, Marius, what have you done to me? Heavy is the head that wears the crown, Nicholas, he gasped. Share this gift with your Babette. Form another council. Do better, Nicholas. Do better than I did. Now end this. I hope God forgives you, I said, placing the blade over his heart. What God? He smiled warily. I nodded, and thrust the blade into his chest, piercing his diseased heart. And just like that, Marius, our creator and the first of our kind, was no more than dust on the wind. Nicholas! It was Babette. You must forgive me, she wept, slowly emerging from the shadows. I heard your screams, but my courage failed me. I should have come to your aid. And then what? I said, taking her in my arms and pulling her close. You would have only died, and that I could not stand. I said, kissing her tears away. What happened? She said, gently touching my face, fingers lingering. Where is Marius? Gone, my love, I said, gently pushing her away as I drew the blade across my hand, the blood beginning to flow. I offered it to her. "What is this?" she said, looking at my blood hungrily. "A new beginning," I whispered, as she latched onto me. "I shall have a new family now." "Who?" She looked up at me, her beautiful face smeared with my blood. "You," I smiled down at her. "You and all of vampire kind." Outside, the sun began to rise. But I was no longer afraid. In fact, for the first time in a long, long life, I was grateful for the coming of a new dawn. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thanks so much for watching tonight's video or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, if you could do me a quick little favor, hit that little thumbs up, since there's no longer a thumbs down, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button and hit the bell, because we're required to say that now, by law. If you guys are listening on the podcast, then I don't exactly know how those work, but I think there's a follow button or a subscribe button or something like that to hit. And as always, I want to give a big thank you to all of my contributors on Patreon. You guys are the real MVP, you guys keep the lights on here, and allow me to do a whole bunch of cool things like exclusive stories that we're getting a lot more of now, honestly. So thank you guys so much for being a part of that, and a very special thank you to all of the big skeleton patrons, such as Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Brian Arce, Bobby Karman, Stephanie Butler, Tristain Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Mask Note, Rashad Collins, Joshua Mullen, Zavium, Dan Pham, Matthew McNeese, Shelly J, Ben Spates, Anna Storm, Jeremy H, Raltizal, Nana, The Morgan, Diamondella, MeltedLake, Tully Sue, William King, Reaper 61167, Darth Miver, Micah Ortiz, Satanic Aries, aisodoehtraed, Nessie, Parafa Panda, Bardo Hawk 764, Melancholy Corpse, Ferb, Lambda M98, Harley, Billy Morrow, Sashi Suzaku, at Grizzly Olsen Pro, Caden the Spooky Boy, Zane Nightshade, My Body Sounds Like Rice Krispies, Lord of the Weebs, Jay, Miss Exandra, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Azarine Fox, Fried Chicken 12, Freddy Krueger, Michael Scarborough, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Infernal One, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Jordan Nels, Hades' Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Fester Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, and Corey Kenshin. Thank you guys so much for being a part of Patreon, and for everybody who's down there in the description, and everybody who even contributes just $1 to patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. And, as always, my friends, sweet dreams.